Okay, great. So good morning. It is Thursday, April 27th, 2023. It's 10:40 and we're resuming work of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We're returning now to H31 and Act relating to aquatic nuisance control. We have 1 hour with a hard stop. We have 7 witnesses. That's about 8 minutes each. And I know that this committee has heard 5-minute testimony and that 5 minutes is enough to tell us a lot, and we listened well. So I'm going to ask everyone to tolerate a tight schedule because that's the nature of the end of the session. But we are very interested to learn what you all have to share with us about H31. And so with that, we'll go right to Julie Silverman, please.
Hello. Can you hear me?
We are changing the batting order. We're going to hear first from Ms. Silverman, then we'll be going to you, Ms. Jones. Thank you for your flexibility.
Thank you.
All set?
All set.
Great. Good morning, Chair Bray and members of the committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on H31, an act relating to aquatic nuisance control. My name is Julie Silverman, and I am the Lake Champlain Lake Keeper for the Conservation Law Foundation. Just a little background, I am an advocate and I engage and inspire people to protect, restore, and preserve Lake Champlain, its tributaries, and the entire watershed. I've worked on Lake Champlain issues and the watershed issues for close to 3 decades. I have been connected with the Agency of Natural Resources. I actually worked for Lakes and Ponds in the Aquatic Invasive Species Program for a while. I'm also currently participating in the ANR Aquatic Nuisance Control Focus Group, as you previously heard from Mr. Groffman as well. He's part of that group. So CLF supports H31 as passed by the House. My colleague, as I mentioned, John Groban, previously mentioned that CLF believes also that it's time to closely examine reforming existing statutory framework. Allowing the pesticide, we want to work on shifting the demands of, we're getting pesticide here. Allowing for the use of pesticides to combat aquatic nuisance species in Vermont waters, especially during a time of shifting demands and climate change. H31 begins this needed investigation. CLF understands the complexity and gravity of the negative impact of AIS, or aquatic invasive species, on the state's waters. I'm personally have witnessed the impact. I have spent a lot of time on Lake Champlain and other water bodies. I've hand-pulled water chestnut. I have put on waders and hand-pulled brittle naiad, and I've done some European frogbit work and bristlepond. I've also been involved with the hydrilla plant survey work on the Connecticut River, looking for emergent invasive species. This is all, again, in an effort to combat invasive species. Just a little bit of information. As of last October, when the was printed by the Lakes and Ponds Aquatic Invasive Species Group, there were 125 water bodies in the state of Vermont that had confirmed AIS. Lake Champlain is threatened by 51 non-native species, and a dozen or so are considered to be of greatest harm economically, environmentally, and to human health.
AIS.
Oh, aquatic invasive species. Oh, sorry.
No,
There's a lot of acronyms. The environment, economy, and human health impacts are significant, but not all aquatic invasive species have the same level of impact, nor do they impact each water body the same way. Every lake, pond, river, and stream is ecologically unique. They each have a different source, outfall, flora, fauna, soil type, water quality parameters, sensitivity, and diverse land uses. When an invasive species is introduced to a water body, the risk varies depending on the water's complex ecosystem. But what they all have in common is that climate change will dramatically impact growth and the spread of invasive species. H31 is a proactive step towards climate resilience planning so that our regulatory frameworks are nimble and effective. For these reasons, chemical pesticide applications should only be used in Vermont's waters after thoroughly deploying the full suite of management measures and, importantly, weighing public health and ecological impacts. H31 allows for a full analysis of when and how we should use those chemical pesticides and best proactively design our statutory regulation framework accordingly. CLF further believes and recommends that we modernize the A&C permit program following the precautionary principles that Mr. Groveman talked a lot about yesterday. We know that in the face of PFAS, and we know that PFAS is a problem for our drinking water, but we also know that PFAS also is in pesticides, and it's leached from the containers as well as an ingredient in these pesticides. Pesticide application has unintended consequence. As you may know already, not all ingredients in pesticides have to be disclosed. And this has huge impact on the health of our collective environment and health impacts. It's no secret that the chemical industry is also staying ahead of regulations. It's a bit of a sort of cat and mouse scenario of we put out a new regulation, we stop that chemical production, they put out a new chemical, and we constantly are on this ever evolving sort of wheel. And perchlorate has only been on the market since 2018, and we simply don't have enough long-term data analysis and long-term public health and ecological impact data on the pesticides. And we know that it just keeps rolling and rolling. A new pesticide comes out to replace the old pesticide. CLF supports incorporating more public process and stakeholder input on the permitting process. Every Vermonter deserves a seat at the table. In addition, CLF and other focus group participants believe that the permit notification process needs to be updated. That includes the ANR Environmental Notice Bulletin. It needs to be modernized to become more transparent. It's difficult to navigate, it's difficult to translate, it's difficult to access, it's incredibly difficult to understand. H31 would allow legislators to evaluate ways to improve the notification process and public involvement generally. The old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, certainly holds true for the ANC. My personal experience in decades on the water and research illustrates that prevention is the most cost-effective method for combating invasive species. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the invasion curve, but I will include that in the testimony as well. But just sort of a little visual here, that prevention and monitoring at the beginning is cheap and easy. It gets more and more expensive when you start to think about prevention over time and eradication. So spending more time, energy, and attention at the beginning of this curve, where scientific monitoring and education and outreach and communication is the most effective to eliminate aquatic invasive species and most cost effective. CLF and VNRC and other partner organizations submitted a letter to the ANC focus group. This was submitted yesterday by Mr. Groveman's testimony, detailing the issues, addressing the issues that we think need work in the ANR rule to help implement the ANC permitting statute. As Mr. Groveman previously testified, most of the suggested changes would require a statutory change. To summarize, CLF fully supports H31, which would allow legislators and experts adequate time to weigh the latest scientific findings and consider how best to reform existing statutes, and to ensure that we proactively prioritize ecological and human health. This concludes my testimony. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with all of you. I will be submitting my written testimony after I get back to the office.
Great, thank you very much. That's a perfect example of how much could get done in 5 to 7 minutes. With that, we will move right along. Thanks again to Ms. Jones, who is joining us remotely. Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to meet with you this way. My name is Jan Jones. I have lived in Hubbardton for about 40 years. I'm a retired public elementary school teacher where my passion was environmental ed. So I'm not here with the kind of expertise that you're hearing from other people, but rather an ordinary citizen. I've worked as a park naturalist at Bomazeen State Park and a nature columnist and an amphibian field research assistant and a public librarian. So I've been all over the place, and I'm going to just talk really quickly to get through as much as I can. And forgive me for that. I want to begin by addressing a few misconceptions and questions I heard in yesterday's testimony. Like many people, I assumed that the EPA approved chemicals like pesticides after rigorous testing. I assumed that, as Senator McCormick alluded to, that they looked through all the lenses, long-term ecology, human health, and efficacy before registering products. But when I became alarmed upon hearing about a year ago that yet another lake, partly in my town, was being considered for herbicide treatment, I read the 247 pages of the EPA 2017 risk assessment of Procelacor, the herbicide, and I learned this: neither reptiles nor amphibians are tested. Only a few surrogate species for birds are used to represent all bird species, 680 in the United States. Benthic invertebrates, the base of aquatic food web prey, displayed chronic toxicity effects in sediment studies at all concentrations. Shrews and star-nosed moles were identified as being at risk because their diet is predominantly invertebrates. The EPA assessment includes no long-range data because there is none yet. It doesn't address potential interactions or cascading effects in the ecosystem as a whole. It doesn't address field studies. Please think about this. Our DEC relies on EPA toxicity studies that never included amphibians. Frogs now chorusing from our lakes and wetlands are not studied at all. Vermont herpetologist Jim Andrews supports H31 and commented, "I think in reality, most biocides undergo only limited lab tests before they are made public, leaving it up to local residents and biologists to see if there are any negative effects in living systems after they are used." To represent the birds now returning to nest, the EPA experimented on a few mallards and bobwhites, determining the chemical, quote, practically non-toxic to them. But what about the piscivorous loons, ospreys, and eagles, and the omnivores who eat aquatic plants, snails, and other benthic invertebrates in the muck? And what about the creeping nymphs of flying insects that will provide food for swallows? Every bit of that tiny life swimming and creeping through the littoral zone, the very place where herbicides, it's the target for herbicides, every bit of that life is potential food for something else. And when I'm going off track here, when the herbicide, it's not very consistent in water, but what it does do is bind to the sediment. And that's what, when I say muck, what I mean by that. The EPA risk assessment, the majority of which is calculated via computer modeling, leaves us with many uncertainties. But this is the answer to yesterday's question to Commissioner Belling about whether Vermont scientists have an opportunity to weigh in on potential risks before an herbicide is used here. Rick Levy's 2-page review of the EPA document referred to yesterday concluded that the findings support the conclusion that the proposed use of Procelacor EC applications pose an acceptable risk to the non-target biota and environment. That is the norm for assessing things like this. That is the sentence that satisfies an herbicide applicant's statutory requirement to to get a permit. It doesn't include a requirement to look at the whole system. It doesn't include the unique attributes of each setting, as our previous speaker said, before resorting to herbicides. It doesn't ask for historical data or an inventory of species. The EPA final registration decision is disconcerting in areas of human health as well. Pesticides have a place in emergency situations, for example, severe cyanobacteria blooms dangerous to human health, or maybe new outbreaks of hydrilla. But I am very concerned that the precautionary principle is being ignored in the management of Eurasian milfoil. It is not a health risk, nor has it been proven to be always detrimental to ecosystems. After 40 years of growth in Lake Bomoseen, our largest inland lake, it has not taken over nor crowded out native plants. In fact, I'll be submitting written testimony that shows that the survey done by Lake Bomoseen shows that native plants are thriving alongside milfoil in that lake. Now another issue, equity in the existing statute. $500 and an application opens the DEC gate. The permit application gets reviewed, utilizes all the A&R resources and expertise for months without input, alternative ideas, or opportunities to ask questions by the other public stakeholders. But meanwhile, if another person or group wants to treat 0 acres of the same lake with chemicals, managing it instead as an herbicide-free control environment, they cannot pay to open that gate and be part of that conversation. Herbicide applications are often, not always, but often initiated quietly by people with privilege and knowledge of how the system works. Most often, by homeowner members of lake associations who pay to join, while the public remains unaware, sometimes until it's too late. Yes, there is a public comment window and notices on the ENB, the Environmental Notice Bulletin, but being invited to comment at the end of a process is certainly not the same as being at the table from the beginning. And it is rare for a decision to be overturned. And I think this needs to change. I recently talked to a fisherman who strongly opposed herbicides based on his extensive time fishing our lakes and observing the real-time changes, real life changes after chemical treatments. He said he was reluctant to voice his experience and opinions because he felt he wasn't good at that sort of thing. It frustrates me to no end that his anecdotal data is not taken into account, is not as valid as computer modeling by someone who perhaps has never set foot in Vermont. He, that fisherman, represents a huge set of stakeholders who are left out of the process for a myriad of reasons. No internet, limited comfort with letter writing or computers, different social circles, etc. Aquatic nuisances are undesirable or excessive substances that interfere with recreational potential by definition. But who, undesirable to whom? Whose recreation? Are kayaks not as important as big motorboats? Are anglers not as important as water skiers? Why should big boats that use the open water also control the edges where I feel the safest paddling, where weeds caught the open water? And control, excuse me, where weeds cut the open water and the shore erosion and the wakes, and where little kids dip their nets to discover hidden wonders. And do ecotourism and quiet sports have a place in this economic picture that we are trying to protect? What about the thousands of us who believe that a nuisance should never trigger actions that gamble with the future, and pesticides are meant for emergencies only? Black flies, for example, are a nuisance. I trust Vermont legislators to protect our natural communities. I still do, but my confidence has been shaken. I had believed that DEC actions were always based on both long-range and current studies, site-specific data collection, deep understanding of ecology, and equity in terms of human stakeholders. The realization that even here in my beloved state, many of the decisions are based on chemical company promises and EPA claims has made me very worried about our future. I understand that, and I am just, this is my last
Can
sentence.
you pause for a moment? I'm running the meeting. Thank you. You are over 9 minutes. Please conclude your remarks.
And this is my
Submit them
last
in
sentence.
writing.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
sorry. I'm very sorry. I understand we're limited by budgets. A study group with a wider lens could make it better. Please pass this bill to ensure that our freshwater remains wild for future generations. And I apologize for my longevity. Thank you
Okay,
very
thanks
much.
for reading 217 pages of the EPA review on a pesticide on behalf of all of us. With that, and with appreciation, we're going to go on to Mr. Steele from Town Pickup.
Go right ahead.
Yes, please join us at the table. So you know we're on sort of the 2-minute drill, but
Yep,
we're listening.
I think I can get it done in 6.5 minutes. so.
Okay.
Hey,
Good morning. I just wanted to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to testify here today. This is a little out of my wheelhouse, so I will do the best that I
Well,
can.
welcome to
with
the
it.
State House. It says guest at the end, so thank you for coming in.
My name is Rob Steele, and I'm a lifelong resident of Bombazine, Vermont. My wife and I own and operate Tom's Bait and Tackle, a bait shop that is in its 50th year of business, 26 of which I've been a part of and 18 as owner. A year and a half ago, I knew very little about how this process worked, as most of the public is unaware of what is happening in our lakes. After learning of a permit applied for to use a chemical in Lake Bombazine and not wanting to see that happen, I started looking into it. The more research I did, the clearer it became that something needs to change. The lack of public involvement in the process is alarming. Unless you are the applicant, odds are you will have no idea what is going on. The lake users, the public, the ones who the lakes belong to, more often than not, have no idea any of this is happening until it's already done. Another flaw when it comes to the public is the fact that the statute doesn't require any notice to the lake users regarding the treatment of the lake. The DEC has created a special permit condition that requires the applicant to post an 8-inch by 11-inch piece of paper at the launch areas and at the end of the roads that access the lake. Generally, these signs end up buried in the tall roadside grass or are stapled to trees and telephone poles, drawing no attention from anyone passing by. Just last year, a lake in my area was treated with a chemical from milfoil management. 8 by 11 signs were put up stapled to trees and a telephone pole along the side of the road. These signs, should anybody have noticed them, gave a date of June 16, 2022 as the treatment date. According to the signs, swimming, wading, boating, fishing, and domestic household use may resume on Friday, June 17, 2022. The problem with this was the lake was not treated on June 16, 2022. It was actually treated on June 21st, 2022. How many people do you think swam, fished, etc. within hours of the lake being treated without even knowing it? How is this fair to the public? Is the public to accept that the lake they want to use could be or has been treated at any time without them knowing? When I asked the DEC what could happen to the applicant who failed to notify the public of the correct date, I was told although they violated a special permit condition, because the statute does not require public notification, very little can be done. How is this not a clear representation of a system that needs to be changed? Many times the Fisheries Division has stated it does not support the use in many of the waters treated for milfoil management. Lake St. Catherine, for example, has been treated for 20 years now with consistent objection from Vermont Fish and Wildlife. Is this the system that we want to stick with? Studies have been done by our own fish and wildlife scientists in which they state that the repeated suppression of aquatic vegetation in lakes treated with herbicides is affecting the population of largemouth bass. And although bass are the main fish species in the state studies in most of these lakes due to their popularity with anglers, there has been anecdotal evidence from anglers reporting decreases in all warm water fish species. We heard Commissioner Beeling testify yesterday that they acknowledged the decrease in largemouth bass, but an increase in smallmouth bass makes that okay. What about the species that share the habitat with the largemouth that aren't being studied? It is impossible to ignore that the possibility of a decrease in other fish species is happening. Just because it isn't being studied doesn't make it okay. Is it acceptable that because we have seen a few more smallmouth bass that other species can be negatively affected? In a recent email from Vermont fisheries scientist Sean Good to Misha Setner of the DEC, Good stated, "I'll be the first one to tell you that angling gets forgotten about as a legitimate public use of a public water body in a project like this being driven by private homeowners. And despite just about every ANC permit application I've looked at in the past 20 years says the project will improve fishing, this is never the case anywhere, except for potentially a Star Lake sort of situation. This statement, along with the fact that there is a noted decrease in fish species on lakes being treated, should be a giant red flag. If we are not improving a fishery and are causing significantly proven decline in one species and a strong potential of decline in many others, are we doing the right thing? Do we continue to allow a practice that is proven to harm species other than what it is supposed to target? The DEC has voiced since 2018 they started working closer with Fish and Wildlife. What changed in 2018? The answer is staff. In 2018, some new staff took over positions and decided changes were needed. One major thing that happened since 2018 is the DEC stopped granting permits for sonar. Sonar is a chemical that was used as whole lake treatments on many lakes across the state. It was used for 15 years until 2018, when the DEC determined it didn't meet the 5 criteria that the statute requires for the permit to be issued. What changed after 15 years? The chemical didn't change. The impacts of the chemical didn't change. The only thing that changed was staff in the DEC. This is a problem. The fact that how a staff member of the DEC interprets the statute can either grant a permit or deny a permit needs to be addressed. While the current DEC may tend to work a little closer with Fish and Wildlife, there is nothing that says it will remain that way. A staff change could put us right back to where we were 20 years ago. We have heard from Commissioner Beeling that there is an internal review procedure that was recently signed by DEC, Fish and Wildlife, and the Health Department. This procedure may be good, but it limits the scope of what Fish and Wildlife are allowed to make for comments. The 2 sections of this internal procedure that interact with the Fish and Wildlife Division are as follows. A, acceptable risk. For a project proposing to control an aquatic animal that may impact fish and wildlife habitat, the Fish and Wildlife Department shall submit a comment on whether the project poses an acceptable risk to aquatic animals, to fish and wildlife habitat, and whether any mitigating actions should be taken to reduce the potential impact. B, public good, and it's the same as what the definition was for acceptable risk. To me, the way I read these is that they do not really allow Fish and Wildlife to offer comments on whether these projects should happen, only on how we can reduce the negative impacts of issuing the permit. The fisheries scientists spend more time on many of these lakes doing surveys and interacting with anglers than many in the DEC, and yet they are not allowed to make recommendations on what they believe to be the best management practices to protect fish and wildlife they are tasked to. Without Fish and Wildlife having a formal role in allowing other agencies' comments to carry weight, the system will remain flawed. It has become very clear to me that more and more lake associations are going to be looking to chemicals to solve what they believe to be the biggest threat to their lakes. I think we need H31 now to ensure that we are doing things the correct way for all sides. H31 could give us the opportunity to review what has been done in the past and create the best plan moving forward. I don't think anyone here wants to look back in 15 years and say, boy, I wish we had done something about that when we had the chance. Now is the time for a review and a fresh start. Thank you for all your time. Appreciate you allowing me to testify.
You finished in 6 minutes and 35 seconds.
I had 6.5 minutes, so my wife timed me with yesterday. And I threw in a couple sentences that I had tried to remove to shave time. So.
Wow. Well, no.
So we have the luxury of 2 more minutes with you. Any committee questions for Mr. Steele?
Mr. Steele, thank you so much for coming in. And so you run a bait
tackle shop.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you clearly are on the ground in the water with the implications of fish populations going down.
Correct.
And one of the arguments that we hear for needing to do this chemical treatment is that it limits visitors. The visitors don't want to see the milfoil, or you know, there's an economic implication of not dealing with some of the problems of these invasive species. I'm wondering, since you also have an economic interest in the fish population, what would the implications be for you?
Honestly, my personal opinion would be that we'd see a decrease in tourism as far as angling opportunities goes. Lake Bombazine, for example, hasn't had any chemical treatments for Eurasian milfoil, and it currently holds the 2nd largest amount of fishing tournaments in the state, and it has maintained a healthy fish population. And according to Fish and Wildlife studies from last year, it appears to be trending upward. Okay. Where other lakes, due to studies, appear to be trending downward.
Wow. Well, if you ever want to come be in the building more, you should.
I actually brought my nephew with me today. He got accepted for what is it?
Oh, the page?
Be a page?
Yeah, something like that. So I was trying to show him.
Nephew, 8th grader next year.
No, he's in high school, so he was. What's the other name?
Boys State?
Oh yeah, Boys State. Sorry, he got accepted for Boys State, so I brought him with me today to just kind of walk around and look at things. So.
Well,
Cool.
thanks to you and your family. You know, we always, for me, the citizens legislature, it's not the 180 people, it's the 646,000 people in the state. So thank you for.
Well, I appreciate your guys' time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And with that, we are staying on schedule, up tempo, going to Mr. Pearson. Good morning, Mr. Pearson. Thank you for joining us remotely.
he has a lot of.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, members of the committee. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, and so as you may have heard, we're doing just a quick touch and go with different people. I know that you have ample testimony and it is submitted to the committee, so thanks for that. If you can stick to sort of highlights, that'll help us stick to a roughly 7-minute, 8-minute schedule per guest. We can always come back to things, but for now, we're just checking in with people.
Great, thanks. I'll do just that. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person. I'm actually on leave and out of Vermont this week, but for the record, my name is Oliver Pearson. I manage the Vermont DC Lakes and Ponds program. We are the section of the Agency of Natural Resource that administers the statutory aquatic nuisance control permitting program. We monitor the health of lakes and ponds in our states, manage these water bodies so that all designated uses, including swimming, boating, fishing, aesthetics, and aquatic habitat, can be enjoyed by Vermonters and our visitors. Yeah, I submitted some testimony and some supporting documents, but in the interest of time, I'll just hit on a few highlights and happy to answer any questions. As was mentioned, we take AIS, aquatic invasive species, very seriously. They have been shown quantitatively to negatively impact recreation opportunities, habitat, decrease property values, all outcomes we are working hard to avoid through our control efforts. We have a limited toolkit to prevent the spread of AIS. Education and outreach is the most important and effective. In terms of actual management projects, there are less intrusive approaches like bottom barriers, suction harvesting, mechanical harvesting that we use for the vast majority of our control projects. But these approaches in certain situations are either too time consuming, too expensive, not effective over large areas, and even in some cases can lead to proliferation of AIS. So in some cases, the only feasible alternative to control AIS and avoid all the negative impacts that these species can have on lakes and ponds and all uses is to use the class of chemicals defined in statute as pesticides. So we're charged with administering those applications that come in to ask us to authorize pesticide use. And it's a process that we take extremely seriously. As you know, we have 5 statutory findings that we need to make before we can issue a chemical permit. And at least in the last 5 years, since myself and Misha Setner, my colleague, have been running this program, we've taken this work very seriously. We've put in place a lot of new procedures and frameworks to allow us to make science-based, evidence-based, and consultative and participatory decisions with other state experts. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but I do think the current statutory framework provides a suitable point of departure for making well-informed, evidence-based decisions about aquatic nuisance control permitting. And our statute also allows for rulemaking, an effort that has not been completed yet, but I'll talk more about that later. I will say that the internal review procedures that we developed proactively without any statutory requirement have been approved by the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife, as well as the VDH and DEC. And that provides a transparent and accountable process to get input from toxicology experts, plant biologists, fisheries biologists, wetland ecologists, et cetera. So despite the perceived shortcomings that Mr. Steele mentioned, the fish and wildlife biologists contributed to that document. They honed in on the areas where they felt their expertise was most useful to the process, and that was signed by Commissioner Herrick. So in my 4-year tenure with DEC, we haven't had any situations where using this framework for accountability, we've issued permits in objection to our sister departments. And I'll talk a little about one case study in a minute. And so I think the approach we have right now, with one entity in the lead for decision-making, but a transparent and accountable process to seek input from other state departments, is preferable to an approach that was suggested yesterday where multiple state departments might have to jointly make a decision, which is an approach that could lead to confusion or stalemate or delay. And often time is of the essence in aquatic nuisance control projects. We need to make decisions quickly, which the current process allows for. I understand there's some interest in how we make our determination about whether or not there's a public benefit to be achieved from an aquatic nuisance control activity. And we have a procedure for that we've come up with. It's based on another piece of the ANSIN statute. I'm happy to answer questions about that if you like. But we do have some criteria to make a public benefit determination. I just want to make 2 sort of final points in my limited time. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of treatments done to date on lake ecosystems, and specifically speaking about Procelicor. We've treated 10 lakes with Procelacor since 2018. This is the herbicide in question for which there's a permit application for use in Lake Bomazene, which we're still adjudicating. But I think the different opinions about that permit applications has led to House 31 being introduced. So I think what's important that I want to share is we know what's happening with aquatic plants after Procelacor is used. This information is on our website, but we do pre and post treatment plant surveys. We've been doing that for 3 or 4 years now. And what we found based on the treatments of all these 10 lakes is that the good news is Procelacor is highly selective. It only targets milfoil. It has no impact on all other native plants, which is good. It has a positive impact on 2 native plants where their frequency of occurrence increases after treatment, which is what we want. And it has a negative impact on 1 native plant called coontail, but only temporarily, and that's been shown to rebound very quickly. And so we know that the plant ecosystem, which is so important for habitat and the life of the lakes, is not negatively impacted by Procelacor, and it actually improves the frequency of occurrence of 2 native plants, which is really important. That's what we want to see. We want to see more native plants and less invasives. So there's a great Pat Swazi from who's involved with the Lake Iroquois Association and the president of FOGLAP, the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds, gave testimony about the impact of the Procelacor treatment at Lake Iroquois in front of House Energy and Environment. I really encourage you to review that testimony if you haven't already. It's a long and detailed story, but the short version is prior to 2021, the lake was suffering from an extensive milfoil infestation and made swimming, boating, fishing, even kayaking difficult or impossible in much of the lake. And I know because I live nearby and I go there at least weekly in the summer. And so I think the real telling statistic is that use of the public beach and the public access area have both decreased significantly as a result of that milfoil infestation. In 2021, we permitted 37 acres of the littoral zone to be treated with Procelacor out of a total of almost 250 acres, or less than 50% of the lake. And the result was, after the treatment, near eradication of Eurasian water milfoil, increased frequency of occurrence of native plants, and no negative impacts we've been able to tell on any of the other aquatic biota, including loons, which nested in successfully in 2022. And I think my other favorite statistic is that use of the lake tripled in 2022, the year after the treatment. And because the treatment was so successful in 2021, there's no need for a follow-on treatment in 2022 or this summer. So to me, these results indicate that the treatment on Lake Iroquois was a success, and this was due to the thoughtful and deliberative process that went into the permitting this treatment under the current statute. And the current statute provided the framework to make that treatment happen. My last point has to do with the ongoing rulemaking effort. As 10 VSA 1460 allows for rulemaking under the Aquatic Nuisance Control Statute, ANR has not completed that to date, but what we recognize after some difficult permitting decisions across all the different types of ANC control projects was that we should do rulemaking. And so we decided to prioritize this and receive the green light from our ANR leadership to begin working on it late last year. Given the significant interest in aquatic nuisance control in public waters, we formed a pre-rulemaking focus group comprised of 21 representatives from a diverse array of interests. Rob Steele's part of the group, Julie Silverman's part of the group, John Groveman's part of the group, lake associations, municipalities, retail stores, depending on healthy lakes, environmental groups, state experts, university botanists, legislators, including Representative Maslin, Representative Chestnut Tangerman. And in a goal to be transparent, we established a website where working documents, meeting minutes are posted for all to review. And we established clear goals for this rulemaking effort: develop definitions for terms used in statute, develop improved public good determination criteria, and develop clear and permit application requirements with more requirements for public participation in the process. This group has met 4 times. We're working through these goals of the group. And as Commissioner Beeling has stated, DEC believes that rulemaking gives us the authority to address the concerns that have been raised around the statute. We're going to make those important improvements this year. However, and this is my final point, if House 31 passes, our rulemaking effort will likely need to be put on some sort of pause or hold or be suspended, as it may not make sense to continue making rules for a statute that is about to change. From my perspective, I think Vermonters would be better served by allowing a group of 21 experts from diverse backgrounds perform rulemaking to rapidly improve the existing statute, as opposed to yet another study committee comprised of only 4 legislators and 3 state experts working to make recommendations for statutory change that may or may not be enacted in the next legislative session. I'll therefore conclude my remarks by asking this committee to allow us to continue our ongoing rulemaking efforts, implement these rules. And if that doesn't address the concerns around aquatic nuisance control permitting, at that point, we can revisit the possibility of statutory change. As Commissioner Beeling has said, DEC does not support House 31. We think the current statutory framework allows us to make well-informed permitting decisions. And I think it would be regrettable if the statutory, if House 31 passed and that rulemaking had been put on pause to allow this study committee to do their work. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for moving right along. One question to Senator Watson.
Thank you. So I have some testimony that's on our website from Ivy Marr, who says that at the levels that we use in Vermont, Priscilla does kill coontail, a non-target native species. The DEC found this in Vermont as they reported in an April 2022 statistical analysis of pre and post treatment data. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, as I said, the frequency of occurrence of coontail decreases temporarily immediately after treatment. We anticipated that because it's indicative, which means that it's close enough to Eurasian water milfoil that there's a risk that coontail will be affected. So we anticipated that. It happened, but it was temporary. The species was not extirpated, and by the following year, our plant survey showed that it had recovered back to its original frequency of occurrence. So there is a temporary negative impact on coontail, but one that basically within a year has no long-term impact on that particular plant species. And that's just one species. You know, there's some of these lakes and ponds have dozens, if not hundreds of plant species. There are 2 species that showed a significant increase in frequency of occurrence, native plant species. All the rest had no statistical change, which means they weren't affected at all by Priscilla. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pearson. We're going to go right along to Ms. Waterhouse. Oh, Mr. Waterhouse, I'm sorry. I have.
It's okay. I'm a third, but I get abused that way.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. So, as you witnessed, we're on the 2-minute drill here, so if you can jump
I
right
see
in.
that. You're very mission oriented this morning.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I greatly appreciate the time, and hopefully you'll hear my words. Whenever I start a presentation, I always have to think about kind of keying things up. So I always turn to Frost when I'm in trouble. And so you have a lovely quote there from Robert Frost. And the second thing I just wanted to mention is the same thing that Oliver just mentioned as well. The Lake Iroquois herbicide treatment testimony done by Pat Susie, dated March 15, 2023. If you haven't read that, please do. It is a fantastic presentation that talks about the detail and the challenges to a lake organization. It's a wonderful document.
All right, we will pull that document and bring it to you. Thank you.
Thank you. The other thing I'd just like to mention is I am a retired environmental engineer from the Air Force. I have 45 years as an environmental engineering consultant. And I'm currently retired, so this is what I'm doing in my free time. I don't own property and live on the scene, but I like the group of folks, etc. So I want to kick off just a little bit about ecological risk. And the one thing I just want to point out to you is milfoil is not a native plant, right? That's all there is to it. I have given you the definitive study from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that was done in 2018, looking at all of the components. This is a risk assessment that they've done. And there are 3 levels, low, medium, and high. Clearly, this one gets high, right? And the one thing that I really want to point out is I heard comments about fish and about what's going on. And the question here is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? What is affecting the fish populations? Will herbicide impact that? I would propose to you climate change and temperature and invasive species are impacting those species. But anyways, going back, it can basically milfoil can outcompete and extirpate native plant species, creating monocultures that alter hydrology, change nutrient dynamics, alter food webs, increase water temperature, and reduce dissolved oxygen. And you can see and measure all of those things. This has been done many times by other organizations and by other states. The other item I think it's really pointing out is that high densities, abundance, and diversity of invertebrates that provide food to fish and foraging space for predator fish are reduced. And again, these are fisheries factors. I'm not making these up. The other item is obviously the impact in terms of cost. The current cost averaging to be able to treat milfoil is about $2,500 per hectare. If you're not up on hectares, that's 2.41 acres. It's tremendously expensive. And I'll talk a little bit more about the difficulty in being able to treat milfoil itself. And I'm sorry you don't have my original version because I have some lovely pictures in the final one. And so if you'd like, I can send that to you eventually. So let's talk about Eurasian water milfoil, again, in terms of invasion biology. So there's a whole study called invasion biology, all right? At first in the 1980s, it kind of started to materialize. And then in 1988, all of a sudden there was this huge recognition about invasion biology. So an example of that would be West Nile virus, for example. We didn't have West Nile virus, and then suddenly it comes to the United States being transmitted by mosquitoes, all right? That is an invasive species, if you will. So in 1988, the exponential rate of scientific input on invasions itself increased, and the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Nuisance Prevention Control Act was developed. That was the first thing that we did in the United States to look at invasive species. And basically, looking at today, the biological invasions are described as the second leading cause of species extinction, all right? That's impact on fish, invertebrates, mud puppies, any of those things that we have and cherish in Vermont. It's only second behind habitat destruction. That's obviously construction and tearing a habitat apart. And on top of that, currently EWM is a priority in 48 of our 50 states throughout the country. In Vermont, our 800 lakes and ponds, only 65 of them currently have milfoil. That's 8% of our lakes are faced with EWM infestations. Lake Bomazene happens to be one of those 65. Of those affected, 10 lakes, or 15% of those that received that have been receiving treatment of Procelicor have found that basically all of the attributes of that have come true. All of the testimonies from those lake locations have become true. In fact, for example, at Lake St. Catherine, yes, in fact, largemouth bass population seems to have gone down, but smallmouth population have come back to its original numbers again. They were being suppressed before. So you don't get something for nothing. And I think that what we're trying to get here is getting back to the original habitats and probably closer to an environment without invasive species. So the next slide is my why slide, the problem with EWM and AIS. I'm kind of beating a dead horse here. There's a lot of testimony that's been provided on this particular topic. But the one thing that I want to point out is that perception of pollution is different to everybody. And so, for example, if we had a dump of oil or gasoline into Lake Champlain, everybody would recognize the hazard associated with that. It would be evident. It's a chemical. It's a bad thing that's going on. However, a biological pollutant is what I would call an invasive species. All right, it's kind of off to the side. Even during my time frame, the 70s, when Earth Day came up in the whole 9 yards, invasive species weren't even being investigated at that point in time. So the perception about that has been slow to take place. And again, that concept of a biological pollutant, I think, is really important to think about. There are no specific criteria in the Vermont Water Quality Standards from 2022 that address invasive species impact or enforceable response criteria. It doesn't exist. It's all chemical based. And if you look at the priority waters list, that's the only place where we start to talk about invasive species and their impact. There are 6 classifications, parts A through F. Category E, if you will, are surface waters altered by aquatic invasive species. That's where Lake Bomazene and the other 65 lakes fall, is under that category of impaired waters, and has the greatest number of, and Bomazene has the greatest number of AIS species, EWM, zebra mussels, and Asian clams next to Lake Champlain. We're not number 1, and that's a good thing in this case. Control of EWM in Vermont is totally dependent on private citizens and organizations like the LPA. That's what we do. That's where the money comes from. Vermont helps us with small matching funds, but we do it. We do the legwork, our breeder programs, et cetera. So the other thing I want to move into now is to talk a little bit about the Lake Bomazene Association. All right. First of all, we're really good people. We have some fantastic people. Not all of us are from the state. Like I said, I don't own property on the lake, but I'm a 3rd generation Vermonter. We are the 4th largest lake in the state of Vermont. We are the largest primary totally in-state lake, if you will. 2,400 acres is our size. Our membership typically fluctuates between 200 and 300 members. Our recurring lake health program includes a breeder program, 2 harvesters used for EWM control and skimming. We're the first lake to complete a stormwater management program. We participate in annual Vermont DEC lay monitoring program. We are currently pursuing a permit to chemically control 620 acres. That's 26% of the lake surface for EWM infested area over a 3-year period, or approximately 206 acres or 9% of the lake each year.
Okay. So we're at 9 minutes, and so I'm going to ask you to, just as I did other witnesses, to please wrap up in the next 10 minutes. I know you have a lot more material.
I do.
We have some great witnesses who have been great citizen legislators bringing us information, and we will read through this, but can you just conclude your remarks, please? Otherwise, we will not get to 2 other people.
Okay. I would just, I'd like to just, if I can, on 2 issues, I'd like to go to one of the misrepresentations. And this representation I would just like to talk about is the concept that Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department does not support the use of Procellacor EC as a viable tool to help control EWM. They do.
Yeah.
There was an agreement that was made. And many people have said that there have been documents from Fish and Wildlife non-concurring with the use of Procellacor. That is not the case. I give you those quotes. I gave you the references for that.
Okay.
So, and the last thing I would like to do then is if I could just draw to conclusions. EWM is a significant threat to all Vermont surface waters, both ecologically and economically. The scientific research by all national and state recognized environmental protection organizations is unanimous on the threats posed by EWM to natural aquatic lake habitats. Risk assessments conducted by both the EPA, multiple New England states, and the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, Agriculture, and the Vermont Department of Health have concluded Procellacor can be used safely for the control of EWM. The Vermont DEC permitting process is clearly a thorough risk-based process, and if not the best, potentially one of the best in the country. Their 4-year study of 10 lakes, 15% of the lake's population, is clearly a wonderful study and really packs down the effectiveness of that control. We need to recognize EWM and AIS and HABs in Vermont for what they are, a biological pollutant, and any proposed moratorium on the waters of the state or individual lakes, for that matter, to limit any or all applications aiding to the control of high-risk lake health issues will only move Vermont lakes at risk closer to an environmental tipping point that we're already seeing in places like Carmi and in Champlain. And the current voices raised in opposition to the permitted control of selective herbicide used to control EWM is hopefully being offered as misinformation rather than a voice of disinformation. And again, I would like to thank you.
Yeah.
And I am just a strong advocate. Please don't adopt H31. Let DEC do its work, and it's the current work and meeting that they're doing now. Let them resolve this internally. Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
so Senator Watson's got a skinny question.
You bet.
How much does it cost to join the association?
The association,
Yes,
this year it's $150 per person.
thank you.
Thanks so much. And again, apologies to you and all the witnesses. We've had to move right along, but we have your testimony, and we will be coming back to this, but we have a lot of territory to cover. It's the end of the session. So with that, we're going to go to the next witness, which is Luca Conte, or Conti. You'll have to correct me. He's joining us remotely.
What happened to Mr. Perry? I thought there was another witness before me.
Mr. Perry has not shown up, so, but he has submitted written testimony, so we're jumping right to you, and you're gonna be our last witness of the morning. We have about 7 minutes, so.
I
please.
believe Rob Evans was taking Mr. Perry's place.
Oh, well, nice to know.
Okay, so we will,
Yes, sir.
we're gonna go to Mr. Conte. We'll follow up with Mr. Evans after we adjourn this morning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you folks for allowing me to present. I'm one of the bad guys here because I'm the co-author of the permit application to use Procelicor and Lake Bomazene. We have opened such a Pandora's box, that I'm sure you're all very aware of the dynamics and the charges and countercharges, et cetera. Let me start with just a little bit of information about myself. Dr. Conti, a PhD in disability management, undergraduate degree in biological sciences. So I am not holding myself as a biology expert or aquatics expert here. I'm 72 years old. I've lived on the lake for 45 years, and I've learned a little bit about milfoil and lake issues over that time and read a few documents, I would say. I'm an avid kayaker. I've been on practically every lake that's been treated with Procelicor. I've been up and down Lake Bomazene many, many times. I'm very familiar with the water bodies and what's been done and not been done in invasive species as well. I've provided written testimony, so I'm not going to read my testimony, A, because it's very boring to have it read to people, in my view, and B, because I'm just going to hit the highlights of my testimony. Obviously, I'm not in support of HB 31 for two reasons. One is that it's unnecessary because the DEC process is very clear. I've worked with the DEC in submitting over 20 applications, most of them for individuals for the right to do some treatment to their shorelines. The other three, these major applications, the Procelicor application, as well as one for benthic barriers and for DASH, running from Float Bridge down to Crystal Beach, basically. Each one of those applications, by the way, required notification of neighbors of each one of the areas that we were going to do that. So in the Float Bridge example, every person who lives on the shore between Float Bridge and Crystal Beach got a letter personally sent from me, our organization, Lake Bomazene Preservation Trust, from the mailing list from the town of Castleton and town of Hubbardton. So when people say this is a surreptitious process, it's not open, that people don't know about things, I think transparency works when people take an interest. Transparency doesn't work when people throw it in the trash. And these notifications have gone out. And similarly with Procelicor, before we could even submit the application, we had to verify that we submitted a notification to all 800 plus people on Lake Bomazene who are on the water for the notice of the intent to send the application. These are all DEC requirements. Now, as I say, I have a PhD in disability management. I am a scientist, and we focus on the facts. The Lake Bomazene Preservation Trust, who is a co-applicant on this project, has been trying to focus on the facts from the very beginning. Our website, Lake Bomazene Preservation Trust, has all of the relevant documents that we've been able to find about many of the issues that have been raised. For example, we have the weed survey that the LBA and the LPPT both had to purchase before we could even do the application. That weed survey was in excess of $10,000. Ms. Jones said earlier that $500 you can apply for a permit and you can put chemicals in the lake. Absolutely not true. You are required to have a survey before you do anything to the lake. You're required to have a survey after anything's done to the lake and every year that you do a treatment. So that's $20,000 every year for a pre and post survey for any kind of chemical that's put into the lake. The mailing that cost 800, 900 people, notification from Procellacor, again, hundreds of dollars. So these are not facile decisions that can be made by an individual such as myself to start pouring chemicals into the lake. There are very detailed procedures that are required by the DEC, including paperwork, regulations, and constant interaction with the staff of the DEC. Misha Setter and I have spoken probably scores of times on many of the issues related to the application, about concerns about applications, about procedures for the applications. And we are still talking about modifications to the application, but we've never gotten there because, of course, this legislation has taken precedence. So let me go back to the facts and just cover half a dozen factual areas.
We have about 3 minutes left, so if you can just
Okay.
pace yourself.
Here we go. Number one, milfoil is not a problem. I think Lindsay addressed that fairly well. Let me just say, we did a private, at our own cost, private confidential survey of 800 Lake Bombazine residents as to what their views were about milfoil. The response was overwhelmingly that milfoil is a moderate to significant limitation on their use of the lake. Now, I've sent you several documents. That summary of the survey is in my opening remarks that you could see there, and also additional information on a weed survey that we conducted. The weed survey, again, you have a document there. Milfoil is present in 89% of the lake, that there are 50% of the plants, 17 plant species who are present in the lake in less than 10% of the water. 16 of those are present in less than 5% of the water, and 3%, 11 species are present in less than 3% of the water. So very clearly strong biological pressure to eliminate native plants from milfoil. Number two, other methods have not been explored. Over 45 years, I've tried personally every conceivable method to remove milfoil, ranging from the water drawdowns that used to be done in the wintertime to use of weevils that have been attempted and tested and did not work, to the current major treatment methods, which are diver-assisted suction harvesting, mechanical harvesting, and benthic barriers. Let me just tell you the calculations from what our actual costs are. If we were to do DASH to treat the 200 acres of the lake that have intense milfoil on the shores, that would be $17,400 per acre. If we were going to do benthic barriers, it would be $54,000 per acre, depending upon how many square feet you did at the lakefront, because you can do 600 to 1,500 square feet only according to DEC regulations. Again, another DEC requirement and rule. If we were to do DASH, that would be, I already did DASH. Okay, if we were to do mechanical harvesting, that's $17,400 per acre. Where did these figures cost? These are the figures that people are actually charged by DASH providers through mechanical harvesting offered on a fee-for-service basis and benthic barriers on the retail market. This is what we, the LBPT, pay for our DASH providers, for the benthic barriers, and for the time of the mechanical harvesters. Obviously, we're not doing $17,400 per acre because we can't afford it. So we do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That was issue number 3. Issue number 4, permit application is done in secrecy. I've already addressed the issue of the letters having been mailed out. The permit application on the environmental notice board has been discussed here, so I'll move on. Number 4, the biggest piece of misinformation, Procellacor is a poison. According to medical dictionary, A poison is any substance that can cause severe organ damage or death if ingested, breathed in, injected into the body, or absorbed through the skin. Many substances that normally cause no problems, including water and most vitamins, can be poisonous if taken in excessive quantity. You probably have read the report of David Wick, or the opinion piece of David Wick. He noted in that piece that the European Union estimated that an individual would have to drink 232,000 gallons of water per day with treated Percellacor water for 90 days in order to meet the lowest level of human potential danger. So obviously that's not realistic. Moving on, the DEC has a facile process and capricious process for permits, and anyone can get a permit. I've already touched on that. I touched on the many steps I'd have taken for the permits I've applied for and the stages that we have to go through on that. Obviously, the DEC has a very detailed process through which not only do they do the applications for permits, but they monitor the lakes. I think Mr. Pearson can speak to that well more than I can. But the point that I'm making here is I trust the DEC. They've done excellent work. I've been frustrated with them because at times, such as aeration, which is one attempted treatment method, they've decided that it did not work. And I respect the science that they presented. So therefore, I think the DEC has shown very clear evidence of competency and attention to these items. And you're holding your finger up, so I assume you want to tell me something.
I'm asking you to conclude your remarks because we have a lawyer coming in the room as we speak, and we need to move to our final piece of work for the morning.
My only concluding remark is evidenced by this hearing just this morning. You've had 2 days of it. What a can of worms we've opened to try to re-examine and redo the entire DEC rules, regulations, procedures, staffing, permit process, and all of the scientific evidence that they have gained, that they have on their website, that they present to people like myself who research whether we should in fact subject my 5 grandchildren under the age of 7 to a chemical in the water. And people are crazy if they think I would even consider Percellacor with my grandchildren spending that time in the water. So that's my only closing comment. Obviously, the DEC has worked very hard on these issues. Please take their testimony into your account.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Conley. Thank you, everyone who's participated this morning. Mr. Evans, we didn't get the word that you were substituting for Mr. Perry. But I will reach out to you, or our committee assistant will reach out to you, and we will be taking this up again. We'll contact you prior to doing that. So sorry for any miscommunication. We didn't hear from Mr. Perry about you being a sub. With that, we are going to conclude our work this morning on H31 and change gears to our final scheduled topic of the morning, which is S5, the Affordable Heat Act, which we've been reviewing over the last 3 days. Ask the council come back in